So in today's video, we're going to be looking at how to program some buttons and create a user interface for our players of our Tic Tac Toe or Noughts and Crosses game are going to be able to interact with and control their game environment. I'm going to start by showing you an example and then we're going to crack on and build that code. Okay, so my name is Angela McCall. This is Point and Click Puzzle Games, my second YouTube channel. And this channel is all about helping people like you learn how to code in the Lua programming language. And I'm doing that by teaching you how to build a mobile app game. So as part of this series on how to create a Tic Tac Toe mobile app game, we're looking today at how to build out our buttons and start to create a user interface for our players to control the app. Now, if you haven't been here before, please do subscribe, click that bell to stay notified as to when I publish another video following this sequence. And if you've got any questions or queries, please put them in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer them. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at an example as to what our mission is today in this particular video so that you can see our end goal. Now, if you need to, go and click on this link up here to go and watch last episode that I've created where we actually built the gameplay scene, because in this video we're now going to hide it when we click that review button and we're adding the buttons to it. So if we dive on over to my left hand monitor screen, this is the app that I've already published as a little example. We will get to, in a few videos from now, customizing more better commands and collecting player names and that kind of thing, but I wanted to show you the review button itself. So there's a game that I've just finished playing, and as I click on it, a couple of things happen. First of all, if you look very carefully at the button, it reduces just a tiny bit in size as I click it, okay? As I click it and I hold my left mouse button down, the game is therefore showing the play underneath, and my button is still being depressed, so the touch event is still continuing at the moment. Now I release my finger off the mouse and the touch event has ended. So it began, continues, and then ends. There we go. And when we do that, we also not only hide the overlay, the actual background, which is semi-transparent, but we also hide the visibility of the big old play button. So look again. There we go. So that's what we need to program for the review button. And then probably a little bit clearer to see is the depreciation of size of the play button. Again, I think it's 95% the original size. I reduce it by. So as I click on the play button, you can see it reduce in size, and now as I release or the event has ended, okay, the new scene loads. Okay, so we've got a few things going on in today's tutorial. So let's start by actually closing this project and reloading our Tic Tac Toe. Okay, so let's just quickly summarize where we're at on our version of this game. So there we go. We've only got a winner statement and no buttons showing. So let's start by building out these buttons. So I'm just going to show the folder for this game, Tic Tac Toe. Where are we? And you can see I create lots of variations. Tic Tac Toe. Select the folder. There we go. This is all our gameplay. Now I've taken the liberty of already populating the images folder with the play button. There we go. And the review button. Now, I will do tutorials in the future on how to style and create your own buttons, but essentially it is just a transparent PNG file, as you can see in the name, okay? So the path there would be images, play.png, and then review.png. So that's just one thing to look out for. We need to load this overlay scene here, so I'm just going to minimize that, and we're going to start by creating the variables that are going to hold the button. So button play and local variable button review. So there are our two variables that are going to hold and contain our objects, which we're now going to design. Now, just like we would on anything else, we're going to use the scene create event to basically build our buttons into the game memory. And to speed up this little process a little bit, because we've already covered the display library and the new image rectangle object quite a lot in previous tutorials, I'm literally just copying and pasting the code from my previous example I just showed you. So there's my object, the button play variable, using the display API library with the new image rectangle, and then we're adding this image into the group user interface, which you can see here, okay? so that and as this is the third group that is loaded into the game, that it sits on top of the others. We've again talked about the layers and layering up in our previous video. We then have the path and the name of the file and the size that we want to show it. So you can see there that the play button is 2/3 larger than the review button. Okay, and then all we have is the X and Y properties of this variable or object, and we basically set it to be centered across the screen here, and then the location, how high up or low down on the screen, is controlled by the Y axis, whereby 30 points above the center line going up, we will put the play button, and we are going to move it 170 points down from the middle line to display our review. And again, this is something that we have covered in other tutorials on this channel about the different coordinate systems that the Lua interface uses. So again, I'm going to put a link up here for you to go and watch that particular video and refresh your memory in order to help yourself style and position your buttons for your own apps. Okay, so there's our button objects. Now I'm just going to refresh the screen because technically these will now show. They won't do anything because we've not programmed them, we've not given them any event listeners, but as you can see now, our buttons are being positioned nicely on our overlay and everything's in the right place, so we're happy. So let's just move my code up a little bit so that we tidy up. Okay, right, so then we need to use now this show event. So part of our scene template, we can prepare the scene by it will show, which we used quite a lot when we was building the board in our gameplay 1 scene. But for us now, we don't really want these buttons to be able to do anything until they are physically fully finished showing on the screen. So we're going to work inside the did, so the objects and the scene did show. Okay, so let's create some space, and we're going to create 2 functions. Now the idea of these functions are that they get called only when the event has taken place, e.g. the button has been used. All right, so the first function we're going to create is an on-touch function for our play button. So on button play touch, and then we're going to give it an event, and then we're going to click down here end, and then we're going to literally repeat this again local, because we're going to build both buttons at the same time because they're so very similar. On button review touch, give it an event to listen for, and then we're going to click end. Oh, there we go. Right, so there is now our 2 different functions. So as you know, I like to put the name of the function as a print statement that will appear over here in the console when the function is called. So the next thing that we need to do is we actually now need to give these buttons event listener. So add event listener, okay, and then we're going to give it a touch type event, comma, and then we need to name the actual function that gets called. So there we go, that's our first one, and I'm just going to copy this, and then I'll have to change the name of the button and the listener. So there is the actual function, and we need to do this for the button review. Okay, now just obviously we've covered this in other tutorials, but if you remember, we always put the event listeners after the function, so as the memory of the game gets loaded and everything starts to get executed. This is a Lua programming language that reads top down on our script, so as it comes down, the game is going to load in the function, so now it knows that that function name exists and it's ready to use it whenever it needs to be. Then we give the button the ability to listen for that event, and when it takes place we can call it and it knows that it exists. So with a little bit of luck, if I hit save right now, as I test these 2 buttons, the name of their functions should appear over on the left hand side in the console. So let's test this by quickly creating a win. Review button first, and there we go, and as I hold down the touch, it's going to keep playing it because it's a touch event, see? Okay, and then the same for the play button. So we know that our event listeners are working, and we know that our setup right now is good to go. So now we actually need to do something a little bit more specific in both of these. Now if we jump back on over to our touch event documentation and our syntax, what we've got going on here in this first one is a function listener that uses the began and the ended. And if you remember in our multi-touch guide up here, the TAC touch and multi-touch, if we come on down, it does explain the differences. So there's a tap detection, which is just the target and the name, but when we use a touch, we have these different statuses of the touch event. So the touch has began. Moved, it's essentially when people are, say for example, using Space Invaders and you need to drag the little spaceship across the screen, okay, that moved is what will then come into force there. We're not particularly using it in this design for ourselves, but it exists if we want to utilize it. Then we've got ended and cancelled, so that the actual game itself knows when it's finished. So to make my life a little bit easier, all I'm doing is coming on down to this function listener. I'm going to copy all of that if statement and the return true, so that I've got the setup correct, and we're just going to change this ID, because obviously we've not given our buttons an ID, but we can do just so that we can test the process. So let's come out of here and come on over to the button play. There's our syntax. So we need to just change the name. Now our button, when we created it, didn't have an ID, but just so that we can create the ability to do this, if we come on down here, we are looking for an ID parameter, so ID or an ID property, whatever you want to call it. And there you go. I'm going to call this button play, and then I'm just going to copy that whole thing, put it underneath here. This is purely, you guys wouldn't need to do this, but it's so that I can show you the testing situation on while we're in this learning tutorial. But you guys, I mean, it's not going to hurt you, it's just that the object itself now has a name. That's essentially all we're doing. So when we come down here and we test that the play object works, we're going to be able to print its ID, essentially its name, onto the console. So I'm just going to copy this entire thing as well, copy it there, as we have populated both those buttons with their name. So I'm going to hit save. Now when we get through this process and we get back to the gameplay scene, all right, if we click on the review button, it now says the touch event took place on the button review, and if we do the play, it says there the touch event began on the button play. We now know that the actual touch setup is correct as well. Now we didn't have any problems with the game identifying which button was being tapped, but I like to be thorough. When I've designed other games and things in the past, there have been occasions whereby the focus of the object that the game is working on gets confused in the gameplay itself. So one of the first things I'm going to do is, if we come back on over to this gameplay scene over here, and we come right down to the bottom, and we come right down to the bottom, there is actually this set touch focus, and what they've done is they've given the object self, so it's the stage essentially, but we're going to give it the event target. Again, we've covered this in previous tutorials when we was designing our boards. So as the event begins, the first thing we're going to do is just so that the game itself doesn't get confused. Now something so simple as this probably won't need this, but I'm literally just going to give it event.target so that the actual game knows what's going on. And I'm just going to copy that and literally do the same in the begin event here for our review button. Okay, and then likewise I'm also going to tell the game when the button has finished being touched, as it were, or the focus needs to end. So I'm just going to copy, and just before that end, the last else if end, I'm going to type that in, and I'm just going to put the word nil there. Okay, so we can unset focus. There we go. Copy, and again just before the end here, make some space. So now when our game, although it makes no difference to the user environment and the user experience, what is essentially happening now, as the button code loads, it's going to look for a begin event. It's going to print on the screen the ID of the button so that we know it's just working with the correct one. But we also want to just make sure the game knows, and so we are basically telling the console which object we're going to be working with, and then when we've finished with it, we unfocus. So that's what we're doing there. Now we actually need to reduce the size to give that touch effect, so we're going to use the ability to scale. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do now is let's work, because both buttons reduce in size when they're being touched to give that kind of depression effect that would simulate real life. I'm looking down at my keyboard, but essentially when we push the button down, if you can imagine, that button is now getting just that little bit further away from our eyesight. So although the button hasn't changed in size, from our visual perspective, it looks like it's got smaller. So we're going to mimic that on our game right now by using a percentage of the button's original size. So let's do that for both buttons again. So we're going to dive on over to the left hand side screen, and we are going to use a scale property of the object. Now if I just come in here after we've set the focus, so we definitely know, the game definitely knows which one we are working in. So let me just create a little bit of space there. Okay, we now need to change the size of the object, and just to show you the code where you need it, over in our display library here we've got the xScale property, and essentially yScale is obviously exactly the same but works on the y-axis. And if you come down again, they've got an example. You take the object, or I should say here, you take the object, you give it a scale, and then you can basically determine what size that scale is. Now if you want to double it in size, just to give you an idea, that's going to change the width of the object by 200%. So 2 is essentially 200. So we're working in decimal places in this process. So if I want to reduce the button size and the original size is 1 or 100, then essentially what I need to do is I need to reduce that button down to say 90%. So it's going to be 0.9 that we're going to be working with. Okay, so I'm going to need to use that xScale. So essentially it's object.xScale or yScale, and then we're going to say 0.9 to reduce it by 90%. Okay, so let's come back on over to our screen. We're gonna type in btnPlay.xScale equals, and we're gonna put 0.9. Actually the play button's quite big, so let's just reduce that down by 5%. So from 1 to, well, 1, which is 100, to 0.95, which is 95%. Okay, so I'm just going to copy that and literally repeat the process. So I'm just going to make sure it's got the Y scale on there as well, because I want to reduce evenly the height and the width of the object so it retains its square shape. I'm just going to copy this, and I think, to be honest with you, because this whole review button, the review button is a bit smaller, and I think it was a bit hard for you guys to see, I'm just going to change that to 0.9, which is essentially 90% its original size. Okay, and then obviously if we are going to reduce it, we need to then scale it back up when we're finished with the button. So let's literally just copy all of that underneath the focus in exactly the same order we did to create the events to begin with. We're going to just return it back to 1. So 1 being 100 or the equivalent of, and then again here we're gonna just copy. Oh, we're in the review. It's a good job I just noticed because I hadn't updated the button name. There we go. And then I'm just gonna copy that, and I'm gonna come down here where we set the focus back to 0. Actually, we need to set the focus after we've finished playing with the button. So I'm just gonna change the order there, and we're gonna change that back to 1, and we're gonna change that back to 1, and let me just reorder this. So actually I want it to be above. So we finish playing with the button settings, and then we remove the focus off of the composer. Save. Now nothing's going to happen again other than the name of the item being used displaying over here in the console, but let's just see if we can actually mimic now, and the button does reduce in size and then release. So here's our buttons. Let's start with the small one, the review button. So I'm going to click on it and it gets smaller, and I release it and it gets bigger, and then the play button, small, and then back. So our sizing dimensions is working, which is great. Now this is where the code will change, because obviously we want to do different things when the buttons are worked with. So let's start by concentrating our efforts on this review button down here. So when the button review is clicked on, if you remember in our original demo right at the beginning of the video, the button play gets hidden, and so does the background object. So we need to use both of those. If we come back up to the top here, we have got our button play, and then we've got our overlay background. And all we're going to do is give them a property which is visibility. So we're going to just turn it off. So is visible equals false, and then we're going to do the same thing with the button play dot is visible equals false. And if you want to remind yourselves about that is visible syntax, when you're in your documentation, up here in the search bar, click in is visible, hit return. It's going to respond with lots of results. The first one underneath this line, and then you can find your syntax, and there's some examples and things so that you can remind yourself what's going on. It's to do with the alpha property. Okay, so let's just remove that down. So we've hidden it, and I'm going to hit save, but we obviously want them to come back when we release the button. So let's copy that and come back up here, and then as we move the scale, let's paste it in there, and we want to put them back to true. And then I think, to be honest with you, that's pretty much the button for the review button coded. Let's hit save, other than giving it a sound effect, which we will do in a few tutorials from now when I deal with sound. So let's just test that review button to see if those two items hide. So we're looking to hide the play button and the entire background. There we go. So our review button is now doing its job, and as we touch it, it is reducing in size. Our review button is done. Let's just tidy up the code. And then what we need to do now is we need to essentially deal with our play button. So this is all job done. Okay, so the last step that we need to do now in that play button is basically tell it what action to take, which is essentially what we want to do is reload the game interface fresh with no character markers showing, so that we can have another game of tic-tac-toe. But herein lies the problem and the challenge, which is why the rest of this lesson is going to be on next video in 2 days from now, because this whole loading and destroying scenes as they need to be pulled into the game memory and or like the brain of the game as it were, and then be used, starts to get muddled. Now you probably won't have too much of a challenge while all the file names that we're using are different, but as we need to reload the exact same game, and therefore we need to recall the same file gp1.lua, the destroy events of the old scene are going to get muddled in with the create events of the new version of GP1, and the composer will get confused, and therefore we're going to need to invoke something called a cut through scene. Okay, so all of this stuff I'm talking about right now is all stuff that goes on behind the game interface. It's like in the brain of the game, which is why all the way through my scene templates, inside each scene I've got that little print line that tells me in the console what's going on in the game. And now in the next video you're really going to understand why it is I've got you guys to do that. So I'm going to stop the video here today on our GP1 scene. Literally the last thing we need to do is now call the composer and load the next scene, but it's not going to be GP1, it's going to be a cutscene. Thank you very much for watching. Click that bell to stay notified. Make sure you have subscribed. Put your comments below. I'll answer your questions best I can, and I'll see you on the next video in 2 days.